Hello, Jesse with Nexus Property Management out of the Worcester office, doing a follow-up video as we continue with our docuseries on evictions here in the state of Massachusetts. My last video, I gave a brief overview of the different types of evictions in the state of Mass. Today, I'm going to go into a little further detail on the for-cause evictions that we've been through. As I stated, for cause, the evictions that we've been through usually have to do with non-payment. Tenant hasn't paid their rent. I believe there's some rare circumstances of like major violations of the lease and or maybe illegal activity going on in the unit. But for all intents and purposes, the only evictions that we've been through for cause here at the Nexus office has been for non-payment. So tenant hasn't paid their rent. It can be at least 1 month behind, and at that point in time, the owner can file for eviction for cause. Before they file, they need to serve the tenant with a 14-day notice to quit. With that 14-day notice to quit, you need to include a attestation form that can be found on the mass.gov website. And basically what that form is information for the tenant on how to get help with their rent that they're in arrears for. It's, I believe, 13 pages long. It's really only 1 page long, but it comes in various languages. So you have to issue all 13 pages along with your 14-day notice that you serve to the tenant. At that point in time, once the 14 days has expired, you can then file for eviction. Sometimes we don't hear from the tenant, and in order to avoid any sort of potential conflict, we will also issue, once the 14-day notice has expired, a 14-day notice of abandonment. It has happened to us in the past where a tenant's received that 14-day notice. They don't want to go to court. They know they're in the wrong. They're not acting very professional, and they just vacate the apartment and they don't tell anybody. So in order to help the owner save the expense of the attorney and the filing fees, we'll post a 14-day notice of abandonment of the apartment, letting the tenant know, hey, we haven't heard from you since posting this notice. What's going on? If we don't hear from you within 14 days, we're going to go ahead and take possession back of the apartment. After that is expired, we will then go in and inspect the apartment. If it looks like the tenant has moved out, maybe they've just left some trash behind, maybe the place is completely cleaned out. If for all intents and purposes using just basic common sense and logic, we will at that point in time take possession of the unit back, change the locks out, and maybe wait a week to see what happens. I'm not 100% sure if this is completely legal, but as a property manager that's looking out for the best interest of our owners, I feel that the tenants sometimes don't act in the most professional manner, and to sit there and waste month on month, approximately 2 months worth of time, because it takes that long to get into court, and then to actually get the tenant there, and then to get the execution, you're looking at potentially up to 60 days. And that's just not fair to the owner, in my opinion. So that's why we post this 14-day notice of abandonment. I feel we're doing our due diligence and trying to find out if the tenant has in fact left. I feel we're covering our basis a little bit by if something should happen, letting the court system know that, hey, listen, we posted this. The tenant still didn't get in touch with us. And then if we do change out the locks and the tenant calls us and says, hey, my locks have been changed out, I'm still trying to get my stuff out, fine, no problem. We'll meet you at the property. We'll let you get your stuff out. But at least at that point in time, we've at least gotten some contact from the tenant and we know what's going on. Now to back up, we've issued the tenant a 14-day notice. They contact us and say, listen, we are not getting out. You're going to need a court order to get us out. That's fine. What'll end up happening is we'll file with the courts for the 14-day notice to quit. And once we file, we usually get into court within 2 weeks. And Once we go to court, it usually goes to what is called a first tier hearing to come up with a mediation for agreement that states that we want possession, the landlord wants possession of the apartment back, and that the tenant is willing to give it back but needs time to move their belongings out. So usually what will happen in that mediation is we will agree upon 60 to 90 days to have that tenant out. But during that 60 to 90 day time period, the tenant is going to need to pay room and occupancy that's equal to the monthly rent. Unfortunately, the landlord is going to lose out typically on the rent that they're owed, the rent that the tenant is in arrears for. But at least you're getting the tenant out. At least you have an agreement in place that says they have to pay their rent. And at least there's an end date to them being there. And that's all works in the owner's favor that at that point, if the tenant does not comply with that agreement. If the tenant doesn't comply, if they don't pay their room and occupancy, or if they're not out by the agreed upon end date, usually the judge is going to rule in the owner's favor, and at that point in time, it's 10 days to get the execution. So you definitely want to get that going as soon as possible. Like I said in my last video, typically consider it a win if you can get that tenant out in 60 to 90 days. I know it's not fair that you lose out on that contractual lease agreement, but once again, in the state of Massachusetts, it's a tenant-friendly state, and most judges look at it as just the cost of doing business. Let me back up once again. So you issue the 14-day notice to quit, tenant contacts you, says, you're gonna need a court order to get me out. You go to the first tier mediation agreement hearing. If you cannot come up with a mediated, agreed upon termination date, then it goes in front of the judge. And now things can get a little sticky. And what I mean by a little sticky is the tenant can claim that they didn't pay rent due to the condition of the apartment. And it becomes a he said, she said situation. Being in the state of Massachusetts, tenant-friendly state, judge always rules in favor of the tenant. When I say they rule in favor of the tenant, what it usually means is that the judge is going to give the tenant a discounted rate for the amount that they're in arrears. What that amount is, it's tough to say. In my next video, I'll give some examples of some of what we've seen in terms of the discounted amounts, but just realize that they will give a discounted amount. The judge will also allow the tenant to potentially get their arrears taken care of through public assistance with that attestation form that you have issued the tenant when you serve them. So they contact the state, say, hey, we need help getting caught up with our rent that we're in arrears for. There's a waiting process that goes on with that. It's about 30 days and then another 30 days to actually get the funds, should you get them. And then at that point in time, the judge will force you as the landlord to allow the tenant to get an answer on their application, assuming that they've applied before going to court, before issuing an execution. The amount that the tenant can get in assistance for the amount that they're in arrears for is $7,000. So sometimes it is in the owner's best interest to wait. That's a good chunk of change, $7,000. Is it worth waiting another 30 days? Kind of depends on how much they're in arrears for, depends on what the relationship is, depends on the tenant situation. And if they're really sincere about wanting to stay in the apartment, very apologetic for getting behind, and it seems like they're getting their ducks in a row to be able to pay their rent moving forward. That's kind of what it looks like when you evict a tenant. You want your money that you're owed for being in arrears, so you file under what is called for cause, and that's a little bit of what it will look like. In my next video, I will give some specific examples of what we have been down and what you could potentially expect for both agreed upon as well as if you have to actually go in front of a judge and go to trial for the amount that's owed. Once again, this is Jesse with Nexus Property Management out of the Worcester office, doing a docu-series on evictions here in the state of Massachusetts. Thank you.